A tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Hello there, and welcome to the Power of Zero Show. I am your faithful host, David McKnight, best-selling author of The Power of Zero, Look Before You Lerp, The Volatility Shield, and most recently, Tax-Free Income for Life. If you are looking for someone to help you navigate all of the pitfalls that stand between you and the 0% tax bracket, why not head on over to davidmcknight.com. We will hook you up with a member of our elite POZ advisor group, someone who has been trained, vetted, and qualified personally by me. Also, if you're an advisor looking to transition your practice to a Power of Zero practice, you can learn more by going over to powerofzero.com. As always, I would appreciate a follow on Twitter. And if you want to review any of my books on Amazon or our movie for that matter, please go ahead and do it. We would really be honored if you did. Okay, a lot of you have been asking me for updates on how Tax-Free Income for Life did during its launch week, the week of November 16th. It actually did quite well. Here is the update. We sold about 5,000 books that first week. That includes all of the pre-orders in the prior 3 months. All of those get aggregated the launch week. Actually, it ended up being the number 3 most sold business book in the world. The only books that were ahead of us were James Clear's Atomic Habits and Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover. So a big, hearty, and sincere thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your participation. I know many of you bought books, multiple books for that matter, and it was a great launch week, so I wanted to give you that update. Today is the first of a 2-part podcast where I will be discussing some of my thoughts about David Walker's new book, America in 2040, Still a Superpower? A Pathway to Success. As you guys know, I have long touted the expertise of David Walker. He was the former Comptroller General of the federal government. He was the head of the Government Accountability Office. He was on the board of Social Security. He was basically the CPA of the USA, and he did that for 10 years under 2 different presidents, a Democrat president and a Republican president, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, respectively. So this is a political centrist who really understands the fiscal condition of our nation better than anyone else in the country, I believe. He got nominated for an Academy Award for his book, IOUSA, that delved into the debt problem. This is back, I believe, in about 2010. And he wrote a book about the same time called Come Back America, in which he diagnosed the problems facing America and laid out some solutions. This book is a recasting of the problem of sorts. He has basically taken the old book and he's updated it with this twist. He's looking into his crystal ball, and based on current projections, he's basically predicting what the condition of the country will be 20 years from now in 2040. In other words, if we keep on going down this road, where does it lead? And so I'm going to divide this podcast into 2 parts. The first part is going to be going over where the vision that David Walker has for our country in 2040, if we just keep on going down this road, if we don't change anything, if we keep on piling debt on top of debt, if we keep on making promises that we can't afford to deliver, if we keep on continuing down the road with a $1 trillion deficit, increasing to $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion, $3 trillion. So he has looked into his crystal ball and he has basically described what he foresees. So I will describe to you what David Walker sees in the year 2040, and we will be able to answer that question. Will the United States still be a superpower at that point? And next week, I will talk about what we can do as a country to forestall that. What can we do to prevent these things from happening and restore integrity to our financial situation and extend the Pax Americana, as it were? All right. First of all, let us define what it means to be a superpower. Okay. David Walker defines being a superpower as basically has 4 pillars. The first one is that we are widely respected around the globe from an economic perspective. We have our fiscal house in order. We have a productive GDP. We are respected by other countries in terms of our formidable financial prowess. Secondly, we are respected from a diplomatic perspective. In other words, what we say on the global scene from a diplomacy perspective actually has teeth. It actually has meaning. The third pillar is military power. Do we have the ability to deter international conflict through our military might? And finally, cultural influence. Is a culture that is in the United States, can it be promulgated across the globe and have a positive impact and impact for good? So those are the four things by which he judges potential superpower. And so this is a lens through which he is interpreting or predicting, if you will, whether we will be a superpower in 2040. So let's get right into some of his predictions. And as a reminder, I try not to wax too apocalyptic during my podcast. I don't think that's too productive, but I think that we need to face the financial issues of our country head on and in a clear-eyed sort of a way and not sugarcoat anything. So with that in mind, I'm going to just go down the punch list and talk about some of the things that David Walker sees when he looks at the trends between now and 2040. Where will we be as a country in 2040? First of all, he says that currently we are at, the U.S. produces 50% of the global GDP. He says that's not going to last long. That'll go down to 18% of global GDP by 2040. He says China and India are going to both have passed us by with their global productivity, and we'll be eclipsed by those in other countries. Secondly, workers to retirees will have been reduced to 2-to-1. We know currently we're 3-to-1. That's a big deal because workers contribute to Social Security and Medicare. And part of the issue with Social Security and Medicare is we just don't have enough people putting money into the program in relation to those who are taking money out of the program. So currently we're at about a little less than 3-to-1. That's going to be down to 2-to-1 by 2040. So that speaks to the insolvency of the entitlement programs in our country. He predicts higher unemployment, economic disparities between classes, and the U.S. standing in the world. This is also interesting. He says, because capitalism has been under attack by younger generations of Americans for so long, and by this point it will have been at least 20 years by 2040, the U.S. has become a welfare state and the role of the private sector has been diminished. I try to remain completely apolitical when it comes to these types of things. My job is not to pick a side on your behalf, but just to tell you the consequences of various political positions. I think this is largely, if I can glean from David Walker's book, this is largely due to the Bernie Sanders movement, and a lot of the younger generation has gotten behind the Bernie Sanders movement and that sort of creep towards socialism. And I think that's what David Walker is seeing and predicting. U.S. annual growth rate, the growth of the economy, will have stalled out between 1 and 1.25%. This is not great for job creation. This is not great for American prosperity, frankly. And I think what most presidents shoot for is 3%. Some people have been ambitious and said 5%. That's just not realistic. It's not even in the realm of, not even the same stratosphere as realisticness, if that's a word. 1 to 1.25% is what he's predicting. That is a problem. That sort of sustained economic growth is just not enough to keep down unemployment. It's just not going to drive the economy, create jobs, create wealth, create prosperity for America. The debt to GDP ratio will be 170% by 2040. Right now, we're at about 106%. I think we'll be 108% by the time COVID is done. And he says, notwithstanding huge tax increases, major reductions in tax spending, and constrained investments, the debt to GDP ratio will still be 170%. Now, remember, Larry Kotlikoff in my movie, The Power of Zero, The Tax Trade is Coming, famously said that the real debt to GDP ratio is not 106%. It's much closer to 1,000% when you include all of the unfunded obligations for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, what we will owe on the national debt over time. So Larry Kotlikoff's prediction, if he's still alive 20 years from now, will obviously be much higher than 170%. It'll be much higher than 1,000%. So that's the trajectory that we're on from a accumulation of debt perspective. He says that due to higher debt level and interest rates, more and more Americans are protesting calls to raise taxes just to pay interest on the debt. So in other words, the interest on the debt by 2040 will be so massive that all of the revenue flowing into the U.S. Treasury under today's tax rates will not be enough to cover all of the debt. And in other podcasts, I've talked about the implications of what happens if we default on our debt. That precipitates a global depression. We do not want that to happen. So they are going to have to raise revenue to be able to pay the interest on all of this mounting debt. And that is going to precipitate a lot of political backlash from all corners of the country. He says increased inflation. He says even the modern monetary theory experts of the 2020 are going to be concerned. In other words, as I've spoken about on past podcasts, modern monetary theory basically says that the federal government does not have to run their budget in the same way that the American family has to run their budget. The American family has a finite amount of money that flows into their household. Therefore, it has to be managed. It has to be budgeted. We have fiscal constraints over what we can spend as American families. Modern monetary theorists say that the federal government does not have to operate by the same rules because they have what's called an infinity bucket. And that refers to their ability to simply print money. And that printing of that money is going to stimulate economic growth, which will in turn prevent inflation from going up. David Walker basically says that's a big crock, that we will see inflation, hyperinflation, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 70s and possibly worse, once these politicians and economists have the ability to enact modern monetary theory principles, which is basically printing our way out of our problems. What else? Higher inflation, lower savings, weak economic growth, which will bring back the stagflation of the 70s. Global consensus by 2020 will be that China is the most powerful nation on earth with the greatest ambitions. And that's measured by those four bellwethers that we talked about earlier. Are they respected globally from an economic perspective? Are they respected from a diplomacy perspective? What is their military might? Do they have the ability to intimidate or deter or what have you based on their military power? And then ultimately, what is their cultural influence? That China will be the global superpower by 2040. The threat of military conflict will have increased. Yet the U.S. will be weaker from a conventional military capabilities perspective. And this is simply because we will no longer have the luxury of spending money on the military because most of our budget will be going to pay for interest on the national debt. And it's interesting that Admiral Bill Owens, who wrote the foreword to this book, he says our growing debt burden is our greatest national security threat. David Walker said that in his 2007 when he got interviewed by 60 Minutes. He said the greatest threat to our country is not a terrorist hiding in a cave in Afghanistan. It's our own fiscal responsibility that prevents us from being able to be military ready on an ongoing basis. The dollar will have weakened considerably, and its global reserve currency market share will have decreased from 60 to 40%. So this speaks to the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. Most countries like to transact their business in U.S. dollars because it's very stable. So right now, 60% of the countries in the world, when they transact international business, they do so in the U.S. dollar because it's stable. What this does is speaks to the instability of the dollar, and that'll primarily be due to the amount that we've printed over time. He says that advocates of modern monetary theory will have caused Congress to be even more irresponsible and the Fed to intervene aggressively by printing more money, which will lead to massive inflation. The federal government will have gone from 21% of the U.S. economy to 28% of the U.S. economy by 2040. And if you throw in what state and local spending adds to the economy, that's going to go up to 40%. Can you even imagine that 40% of the U.S. economy will come from spending from various levels of government. And if we know one thing about government, it doesn't exactly allocate resources in the most efficient way. Therefore, we know that if 40% of our economy comes from government spending, then that's not going to lead to a lot of private sector investment, the type of investment that really does spur economic growth. And to that end, he says the private sector, which tends to drive economic growth, will have declined considerably. And this is primarily as a result of education. 50% of graduates from public elementary schools will lack basic language, math, and technology skills. So that's driving a lot of the economic malaise, as we're just not producing the types of entrepreneurs and workers that can drive our economy on a global scale. Politicians, this is important. This feeds really well into the POZ narrative about where we see things trending. Politicians are calling for even higher taxes and greater wealth redistribution. Taxes are likely to rise over time. By 2040, they will still be thinking that higher taxes is a solution, that wealth redistribution is the way to go. What are the unintended consequences of that? He says poverty rates among seniors will skyrocket, and that will be primarily due to changes that have to be made to Social Security and Medicare when they run out of money in 2025 and 2030, respectively. Remember, before COVID hit, that was going to run out of money, I think, in 2028 and 2033. So everything got accelerated by 3 years, according to David Walker. Eligibility ages will have been raised and benefit levels will have been reduced, and that will feed into that poverty rate among seniors by 2040. This is interesting. He says many wealthier individuals will consider leaving the United States, and that Canada will be the primary beneficiary of that. They just don't see that that they won't be able to escape that economic malaise that pervades America unless they actually leave the country. He says the Pax Americana will be over. The Pax Americana is that period of relative peace and prosperity in the Western Hemisphere of the world in the immediate wake of World War II. He says that will be over by 2040. And then for the first time in history, the quality of life of future generations of Americans may not be better than the past. So really, that's David Walker's dark vision for 2040. If we keep on our current path, and he said this in the past, he says, the fact is we don't face an immediate crisis. He said this back in 2010. He says that now. We don't face an immediate crisis in the sense that we're not going to default on our debt tomorrow. But the real crisis is that we are on a trajectory that leads to a really bad place unless we can make some serious changes. And next week, I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to leave you in a really bad mood in perpetuity. Next week, we will talk about some of the things that David Walker says that we can do to shore up the fiscal condition of our country. And these are really strong recommendations. It takes a lot of political willpower. It's going to take a lot of reaching across the line, reaching across the aisles. It's going to take a lot of participation on the part of America and the citizenry when it comes to voting. And it's going to take a lot of leadership in the halls of Congress to pull this off. But he says it is possible. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. We're going to talk about that next week. And I'm very impressed with some of the solutions that David Walker. So this is a two-part podcast. I wanted to lay out the problem, where we're headed, and then the solutions next week. Thanks for tuning in. Again, if you are looking for someone to help you navigate all of this, head over to davidmcknight.com. We'll hook you up with a qualified Power Zero advisor. And if you are a financial advisor who's looking to transition your practice to a Power Zero style practice, we are happy to help. Go over to powerofzero.com. And of course, as always, subscribe. Thanks so much. We'll see you same time next week.